Have you ever imagined that your pet could be a hidden hero? An incredible story is about to unfold, full of surprises and emotions. What happens when the unexpected becomes reality? Find out in this thrilling narrative that will change your view on loyalty and courage. But before we begin, if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and give us a like to support our work. The afternoon sun bathed the quiet streets of Millbrook, where 78-year-old Margaret Thompson lived in her modest red brick home. With her gray hair tied in a loose bun and gold-framed glasses perched on her nose, Margaret was a beloved figure in the neighborhood. That Thursday afternoon, as usual, Margaret was preparing for her daily walk in the local park. Beside her, Max, her faithful golden-furred Labrador, wagged his tail excitedly, his brown eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Let's go, my dear," Margaret said fondly, grabbing the faded blue leash hanging by the door. Max barked joyfully in response, spinning in circles as Margaret clipped the leash onto his collar. As they walked along the cracked sidewalk, Margaret noticed the concerned look of her neighbor, Sarah, who was watering flowers in her front garden. "Margaret, dear," Sarah called, setting down the watering can. "Are you sure you want to go out now? I heard on the news that crime is on the rise." "Around here?" Margaret smiled, her wrinkles deepening around her eyes. "Don't worry, Sarah. I have Max with me, and besides, I can't stay cooped up in the house all the time, can I?" Sarah sighed, clearly unconvinced. "Just be careful, okay? And don't stay out too late." Margaret nodded in agreement and continued on her way, Max trotting obediently beside her. The park wasn't far, just a few blocks away. The trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, and the scent of freshly bloomed flowers lingered in the air. When they arrived at the park, Margaret released Max from his leash, allowing him to run freely across the well-kept green lawn. She sat on her favorite bench, watching with a smile as Max chased butterflies and curiously sniffed nearby bushes. "He's a sweetheart, isn't he?" A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Margaret looked up and saw a young woman sitting beside her, her eyes fixed on Max. "Oh, yes," Margaret replied proudly. "Max is my only family now. I don't know what I'd do without him." The young woman smiled, but there was a shadow of concern in her eyes. "I heard there's been some trouble around here lately. Aren't you afraid to come alone?" Margaret shook her head. "Max protects me. He may seem like a playful goofball, but I'm sure he'd defend me if needed." The conversation continued for a few minutes until the young woman said goodbye and left. Margaret stayed a little longer, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the peace of the park. Only when the shadows began to lengthen did she realize she had stayed later than planned. "Come on, Max," she called, attaching the leash again. "It's time to go home." As they walked back, Margaret noticed the streets were eerily empty. The silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional jingle of Max's leash. A sense of unease began to form in her stomach. Suddenly, a group of young men appeared from a side alley. They wore leather jackets and had hard expressions on their faces. Margaret instinctively tightened her grip on Max's leash, her heart racing. "Hello, Granny," one of the guys said, a malicious smile forming on his face. "Isn't it a bit late for a walk?" Margaret swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "We're just heading home," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. The leader of the group, a tall young man with a nose piercing, stepped forward. "What a coincidence. We're looking for something to do too. How about giving us your purse for some entertainment?" Max, who had been quiet until then, started growling softly. The fur on his back bristled, and he positioned himself protectively in front of Margaret. "Please," Margaret begged, her voice faltering. "I have nothing of value. Just let us go." The leader laughed, a cold sound. That made Margaret shiver. "I don't think you understand, Granny. We're not asking." At that moment, Max barked loudly, startling everyone. His bark wasn't the friendly sound it usually was, but something fierce and threatening. The young men hesitated, uncertain as they looked at the dog that once seemed harmless. Margaret, feeling a courage she didn't know she had, straightened her shoulders. "You heard my dog. You better leave us alone." The tension in the air was palpable. The young men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this resistance. What would happen next? Margaret held on to Max's leash tightly, silently praying for a miracle. Margaret sat in the police station, her hands trembling slightly as she stroked Max. Detective Parker, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, sat across from her, flipping through a thick folder. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, "I understand this situation must be confusing for you. Let's start from the beginning, okay?" Margaret nodded, swallowing hard. "Of course, Detective. What would you like to know?" "Tell me how you met Max," Parker asked, leaning forward with interest. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering. "It was 2 years ago, right after my husband George passed away. I felt so lonely. A friend suggested I adopt a pet. At the shelter I saw Max. He looked as sad as I was." Parker made notes, nodding. "And in these 2 years, did you notice anything unusual about his behavior?" Margaret hesitated. "Well, he's always been very protective. And sometimes when we passed by the police station, he would get agitated, as if he wanted to go in." The detective exchanged a meaningful glance with his partner. "Mrs. Thompson, we believe Max is actually Maximus, a police dog who went missing 3 years ago during a bust on a drug gang." Margaret gasped, looking at Max in amazement. "But how is that possible?" Parker sighed. "The operation went wrong. Maximus was presumed dead, but his body was never found. Apparently he survived and ended up on the streets, eventually reaching the shelter." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. "So, are you going to take him away?" The detective smiled gently. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, we'd like to propose something different. Maximus, or Max as you call him, clearly formed a strong bond with you. And you've provided a loving home for him. We don't want to separate you two." Margaret let out a sigh of relief, hugging Max tightly. "However," Parker continued, "Max's skills could be invaluable to us. We'd like to propose a partnership. You and Max could work with us on special cases where his unique abilities would be useful." Margaret blinked, surprised. "Me? But I'm just an old lady." Parker's partner, Detective Chen, a stern-looking Asian woman, spoke for the first time. "Mrs. Thompson, you showed exceptional courage tonight. Besides, Max trusts you. That combination can be very valuable." Margaret looked at Max, who stared back with eyes full of trust. She felt a wave of determination rise within her. "Well, I suppose we could give it a try." The detective smiled, pleased. "Great," said Parker. "We'll start with some basic training for you, and refreshers for Max. There's one case in particular we'd like your help with." In the following weeks, Margaret and Max plunged into a whole new world. The training was exhausting but rewarding. Margaret discovered skills she never knew she had, while Max seemed to relive his glory days. The case they were working on involved a series of mysterious thefts at nursing homes around the city. The thieves seemed to have insider knowledge of the residents' schedules and routines. On a cold autumn night, Margaret and Max were positioned near a nursing home that the police suspected would be the next target. Margaret, dressed as a simple lady walking her dog, watched the surroundings carefully. "See anything suspicious, Margaret?" Parker's voice crackled in her hidden earpiece. "Nothing yet," she murmured, adjusting her scarf. "Max is calm too." Suddenly, Max became alert, his ears perking up. Margaret followed his gaze and saw a van discreetly parking at the back of the nursing home. "Parker," she whispered, We've got movement. A white van. No markings. Got it. Stay sharp, but don't approach, Parker instructed. Margaret watched as 3 figures emerged from the van, all dressed in black. They moved with familiarity, as if they knew the place well. Max began tugging on the leash, eager to act. Margaret calmed him with a gentle touch. Easy, boy. Not yet. The figures approached a side entrance. One of them pulled out something that looked like a master key. They're going in, Margaret informed. Looks like they have access. All right, we're moving in, Parker said. Margaret, you and Max stay put. We'll handle this. Margaret watched as police cars quietly approached. Officers quickly surrounded the building. Within minutes, shouts and commands to surrender echoed through the night. Parker approached Margaret, smiling. Great job, you two. We caught them in the act. Margaret smiled, petting Max. Who are they? Parker's smile faded. Well, this is where things get complicated. Margaret, I think you should see this. He led her to where the suspects were being placed in the patrol cars. When Margaret saw one of their faces, her heart nearly stopped. It can't be, she whispered, shocked. The handcuffed man was Tom, the kind nurse who had cared for George in his final days. He looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. Shame and regret were evident on his face. I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, he murmured as he passed by. I had no choice. Margaret stood frozen, trying to process this unexpected twist. How could Tom, who had been so caring towards George, be involved in something like this? Parker placed a hand on her shoulder. Margaret, I know this is a shock, but we need your help to understand what's going on here. You know Tom. Maybe you can help us figure out what drove him to this. Margaret looked at Max, who stared back with understanding eyes. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of this new responsibility. Yes, she finally said. I'll help. We need to find out the truth behind all of this. As the patrol cars drove off and the night returned to silence, Margaret knew her life had changed forever. What had started as a simple partnership with the police had now turned into something much deeper and more personal. With Max by her side, she was ready to unravel this mystery, no matter where it led her. Margaret sat in the interrogation room, staring at Tom through the glass. His face, once kind and compassionate, was now marked by exhaustion and guilt. Max, sitting beside her, remained alert, sensing the tension in the air. Are you ready for this? Detective Parker asked, his voice gentle but firm. Margaret took a deep breath. Yes, I am. I need to understand why he did this. She entered the room, and Tom looked up, surprised to see her. Mrs. Thompson, Why, Tom? Margaret interrupted, her voice trembling. Why would you do something like this? Tom lowered his eyes, his handcuffed hands trembling on the table. I had no choice, Mrs. Thompson. They have my daughter. Margaret felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Your daughter? But you never mentioned... Emily, Tom said, his voice breaking. She's 8 years old. I hid her from everyone to protect her. But they found out. Who are they, Tom? Margaret asked, leaning forward. Tom hesitated, fear evident in his eyes. A group. They call themselves the Guardians. They say they're protecting the elderly, but really they're robbing them. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. And how did you get involved with them? It was after Mr. Thompson passed away, Tom explained, tears in his eyes. I was struggling financially. Emily needed expensive medical treatment. They approached me, offered money in exchange for information about the wealthy residents at the nursing home. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering Tom's kindness during George's final days. So, from the beginning? No, Tom exclaimed. At first I really cared. But then I got trapped. And when they threatened Emily, I saw no other way out. Outside the room, Parker and Chen watched closely. "This is bigger than we thought," Chen murmured. Parker nodded. "And Margaret is right in the middle of it all now." Back in the interrogation room, Margaret struggled to process everything. "Tom, you need to tell us everything about these guardians. Where are they keeping your daughter?" Tom shook his head, desperate. "I don't know. They never told me. They only gave me orders over the phone." At that moment, Max began barking furiously, scratching at the interrogation room door. Margaret stood up, alarmed. "What's wrong, boy?" Parker opened the door, allowing Max to enter. The dog went straight to Tom, sniffing him intensely. "What's going on?" Tom asked, confused and scared. Margaret watched Max, recalling his training. "He senses something. Tom, are you carrying something you haven't shown us?" Tom paled. I don't." Max barked again, focusing on Tom's leg. Parker approached, cautious. "Tom, please lift the leg of your pants." With trembling hands, Tom obeyed. Attached to his leg was a small electronic device. "Oh my God," Margaret gasped. "Is that a tracker?" Parker examined the device. "Not just a tracker. It has a built-in microphone. Tom, you've been transmitting everything to the Guardians." Tom's face contorted in pure terror. "No! I didn't know! They said it was just to locate me, to make sure I followed orders." Margaret felt her heart race. That means they know Tom's been caught. And if they have his daughter... Parker was already in action, shouting orders to his team. "We need to trace this signal now. The girl could be in danger." The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. The police managed to trace the signal from the device to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Margaret, against Parker's protests, insisted on accompanying the operation with Max. "I know Tom," she argued, "and Max has an exceptional sense of smell. We can help find Emily." Reluctantly, Parker agreed, but insisted Margaret stay in the surveillance van with him and Chen. When they arrived at the location, the tension was palpable. Tactical teams positioned themselves around the warehouse, ready to act. Margaret watched the monitors in the van, her heart pounding. Movement detected inside, an officer reported over the radio. Parker gave the signal to move in. Margaret held her breath as she watched the teams enter the building. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Suddenly, an officer's voice sounded over the radio. "We have the girl. She's safe." Margaret let out a sigh of relief, tears in her eyes. But the joy was short-lived. "Suspects fleeing," shouted another officer. "2 vehicles heading out the back." Parker cursed under his breath. They must have been alerted when we turned off Tom's tracker. It was then that Max started barking and scratching at the van's door. Margaret looked at Parker. "Let us help. Max can track them." Parker hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but you stay in the car with me." They set off, following Max's directions. The dog barked more intensely as they approached one of the fleeing vehicles. "There!" Margaret shouted, pointing to a black car making a sharp turn. Parker accelerated, skillfully maneuvering through the streets. The car ahead of them skidded, nearly flipping over before crashing into a pole. When the vehicle stopped, 2 men jumped out and started running. Max barked furiously, pulling on his leash. "Stay here," Parker ordered Margaret, chasing after the suspects with Chen. Margaret watched, heart in her mouth, as the detectives pursued the suspects. Max continued barking, restless. "I know, boy," Margaret murmured. "I want to help too." That's when she noticed something in the rearview mirror. A 3rd man was limping away from the crashed car, but quickly. "Parker!" she shouted over the radio. "There's another one getting away." Without thinking twice, Margaret opened the door. "Come on, Max!" Together they began chasing the fleeing suspect, entering a dark alley. The man looked back, seeing the unlikely duo pursuing him, and picked up the pace. Margaret felt her legs, protesting, but the adrenaline pushed her forward. Max ran ahead, barking and leading the way. The alley ended in a tall fence. The suspect started climbing it, but Max reached him, grabbing his pant leg with his teeth. "Stop right there!" Margaret shouted, breathless as she reached them. The man froze, looking in disbelief at the elderly lady and her dog who had cornered him. Moments later, Parker and Chen arrived, handcuffing the suspect. "Margaret," Parker said, both admiring and exasperated. "You're incredible and crazy at the same time." Margaret smiled, petting Max. "We're a team, aren't we?" As they were taken back to the station, Margaret reflected on the turn her life had taken. From a lonely widow to a police partner, she now found herself at the center of a case that could dismantle an entire criminal organization. And to think it all started with the decision to adopt a dog. Back at the station, Margaret watched through the glass as Parker interrogated the suspect she and Max had captured. The man, identified as Richard Dawson, was one of the leaders of the Guardians. His face, marked by emotional scars more than physical ones, told a story of wrong choices and late regrets. "Never thought I'd be caught by a lady and her dog," Dawson murmured, a bitter smile on his lips. Parker leaned over the table. "Tell us everything about the Guardians. Dawson, how did this organization start?" Dawson sighed deeply. "It started with good intentions, believe it or not. We were a group of nurses and social workers who saw the elderly being mistreated or neglected by their families. We wanted to protect them." "And how did that turn into a criminal operation?" Chen asked, her voice heavy with skepticism. "Money," Dawson replied simply. "We realized many of these elderly were rich, but their families just wanted the inheritance. We started redistributing that money, convincing ourselves we were doing the right thing." Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. The intentions might have been good at first, but the road to hell. Parker kept pressing. "And Tom? How does he fit into all this?" "Thompson was perfect," Dawson explained. "He worked at a luxury nursing home, had access to valuable information. When we found out about his sick daughter, well, it was easy to manipulate him." Outside the room, Margaret felt tears in her eyes. She thought of Tom, his daughter Emily, and all the lives affected by this web of lies and manipulation. Meanwhile, in another room, Emily was playing with Max, her eyes shining for the first time in months. The girl, thin and pale, but with a resilient spirit, had instantly bonded with the dog. Margaret entered quietly, watching the scene. Emily looked up, a shy smile on her lips. "Is he yours?" Margaret nodded, sitting beside the girl. "Yes, that's Max. He's special, you know. He was the one who helped find you." Emily hugged Max tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. At that moment, Tom was brought into the room, handcuffed but with his eyes fixed on his daughter. "Emily!" he cried, his voice breaking. The girl ran into her father's arms, the handcuffs not preventing Tom from hugging her with all his might. "I'm so sorry, my love. Forgive me," he repeated between sobs. Margaret watched the scene, her heart torn between compassion and disappointment. Tom had made serious mistakes, but his love for Emily was undeniable. Parker entered the room, his face a mask of professionalism, but his eyes betrayed his emotion. "Tom, we need to talk about what happens now." In the hours that followed, a deal was struck. Tom would fully cooperate, providing all the information he had about the Guardians, in exchange for a reduced sentence and assurance that Emily would stay in the care of her aunt. Margaret, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, decided to do something she had never imagined. She offered to be Emily's legal guardian while Tom served his sentence. "I can't replace your father," she said to the girl, "but I can promise you and Max will have a safe and loving home." Emily, with tears in her eyes, hugged Margaret. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson." In the months that followed, Margaret's life changed completely. Her home, once quiet and lonely, was now filled with laughter, barks, and the sound of footsteps running through the halls. Emily thrived under her care, her health improving daily. Tom, serving his sentence, received regular visits from Margaret and Emily. He worked tirelessly with authorities, helping to dismantle the Guardians and recover millions in stolen funds. One day, while walking in the park, Emily held Max's leash with one hand and Margaret's hand with the other. "Mrs. Thompson," she said hesitantly, "can I call you Grandma?" Margaret felt her heart fill with a joy she hadn't experienced in years. "Of course you can, dear. I would be honored." As the months turned into years, the unlikely family that had formed, an elderly widow, a resilient girl, a loyal dog, and a father seeking redemption, proved that love and compassion could flourish in the most unexpected circumstances. The case of the Guardians became a milestone in the fight against elder exploitation. Margaret, with her unique experience, became an active voice in the community, working to improve conditions in nursing homes and raising awareness about the rights of the elderly. When Tom was finally released, he found not only his daughter waiting for him, but an expanded family. Margaret had kept her promise, caring for Emily and keeping the connection between father and daughter alive. On a sunny afternoon, as everyone gathered in Margaret's garden, Tom approached her, his eyes full of gratitude. "Mrs. Thompson, Margaret, I can never thank you enough for everything you've done." Margaret smiled, watching Emily play with Max. "You know, Tom, when George died, I thought my life was over. But look at us now. It's never too late to start over, to do the right thing." Tom nodded, tears in his eyes. "You gave us a second chance. All of us." Margaret took Tom's hand, gently squeezing it. "No, Tom. We gave each other a second chance. And that, more than anything else, is the true treasure we found on this journey." As the sun set on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the garden, Margaret looked at her unlikely family and smiled. Life had taught her that love, compassion, and the courage to do the right thing could turn even the darkest situations into something beautiful and meaningful. And it all began with the decision to open her heart to a stray dog named Max. Dear listeners, Margaret's story reminds us that it's never too late to start over, to make a difference. Each of us has the power to change lives, including our own. How about reflecting? What would you do if you were in Margaret's place, or Tom's? How would you deal with difficult choices and second chances? Our stories are full of valuable lessons and inspiration. If you enjoyed this narrative and want more content that makes you think and moves you, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Each story is an opportunity for growth and reflection. Leave a comment with your thoughts and how this story touched you. Together, we can create a community of people seeking inspiration and personal growth. See you in the next story.